merely be good writers.
So here's a criticism that you've probably heard and you probably made, and that is that the entry level for across the board for fantasy and science fiction is kind of high because science fiction especially is in conversation with writers today are in conversation with previous writers, and so that a lot of the science fiction that's written today, take Charlie Strauss, for instance, who I think is a brilliant writer. It's really hard to read him unless you've read science fiction, at least the Accelerando, let's just use that as an example. It's really hard to read that unless you've read science fiction because the neologisms are fast and furious and the ideas are throwaway. I mean, the things that, in olden days somebody might have had a paragraph from the Encyclopedia Galactica explaining, he just says the name and then you're gone. Wow, the next thing. So that raises the bar for someone who is just kind of interested in this stuff. How do I get into this? Which is one of the reasons why maybe YA are so hot, because at least in YA, maybe the sophistication of the prose doesn't necessarily need to be lowered, but the sophistication of the ideation needs to be at least accessible to someone who's never read, Cordwainer Smith or something like that. But it goes to your point that if you have read all this stuff and you've internalized it, how do you write so that you're accessible to the beginners or the idly interested, or someone says, "Oh, I saw that George R.R. Martin show on TV. That looked kind of cool. I think I'll start reading it." But wait a minute, can I read it? I mean, am I going to get it from paragraph 1?
Everything I've ever written has been written as simply as I can possibly make it. And normally when I say that, people laugh. Because my stuff does come out pretty complicated. But I think all you can do is try to write as well as you can, and that's your job. I try to write as well as I can, and I try to write something new, something like nobody has ever written before. And if you're doing that, then it moves you into a simpler, clearer territory where what you're doing is more obvious to the reader.
And so that's something that I think that we have in common, and that is, if you track our careers, we've moved around a lot in terms of where we were to where we are to what we're doing, what we're planning on doing tomorrow, not only thematically, but also in different genres. I mean, I'm trying to write a YA now just because I'm interested in that problem of how do I write so that I can write with the complexity that my readers would expect, but also that I could hand this to a 12-year-old and they wouldn't run screaming from the room. Or, so some people would say, well, when I started writing cyberpunk stuff, that I was like chasing a trend, or when you collaborated with Bill Gibson, or blah, blah, blah. There's lots of the cultural...
I was collaborating with Bill Gibson
before he was Bill Gibson. I know.
But the time I wrote, he was as unknown as I was.
But there are cultural trends that are extremely interesting, that when they flash by, you say, well, I'd like to try that, or maybe I can write a comment on that in fiction. And so this is something that you've been doing as well. I think that you've been looking at what's been going on in the genre and sometimes weighing in with a comment on it that is that is also a fine piece of fiction as well.
I never write fiction to describe in terms of what's going on. I just write it in terms of what seems like the most interesting story that I can write then. And I'm really against people trying to write, anybody who tries to write a cyberpunk story should be aware of the fact that once you try to write a cyberpunk story, that it's over. Anything can be defined is pretty much over.
Right.
With the exception of steampunk, oddly enough, and I have no explanation for steampunk. I find it really interesting. Also, if you look at steampunk, I could find you steampunk stories from the late 60s.
Sure.
By people you never heard of.
Right.
It's just a tendency in our culture. I think what you and I have strongly in common is that we have never chased after the dollar.
Wait, is that a good thing? Yeah, right. Okay. Ooh, that was a low blow. We hope he's not going to hear this. So, yeah.
I'll cut that from the transcript.
But we had many people of our generation, which is when we were waving over here at this group over here, who were chasing the buck, and they chased it right out. Many of them chased it right out of the field.
Right out of the field. It's like horror came up really big, and
Right.
a lot of people went chased into horror,
Right.
and then when it closed down, somehow it took them with them. And I was very aware when Bill Gibson became big that there was a successful niche for an imitation Bill Gibson. And I could have followed that, although I believe it would have just made Bruce bilious to
Right.
contemplate. But I didn't see that there was any artistic validity to doing imitation real stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think it's in part our entire generation. There was that whole hippie idealism. My business plan was that I was going to be incredibly poor for the rest of my life and live in squalor and have hot sex with tippy chicks.
And
That
be
was my
on
business
panels
plan.
someday when we grew up, right?
And then later on, when I was old, 50 or whatever, then I would be pudgy and sell out.